Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into, well, a monumental century of history. It's a period that's really defined by faith, profound failure, and the sheer audacity of just starting over.
It really is. You sent us a massive stack of source materials, chronological charts, all these ancient texts, and they're all focused on the return from the Babylonian exile. It's a story that spans, what, roughly 100 years?
100 years, and the reigns of multiple Persian kings, it gets complicated fast.
That's right. For those of you tracking world history, this is what's known as the post-exilic restoration period. It's documented primarily in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but also the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi come into play.
And it is one of the most chronologically challenging periods to track.
Oh, absolutely, because the biblical text itself, it jumps. It jumps forward and backward to make these, thematic points, not always to give you a straight timeline.
Exactly. And that's our mission today. It's crucial. We're not just reading the story. We are trying to become expert guides to this complex timeline. We need to clearly delineate between the different phases.
Right.
You have the initial highly enthusiastic return that's focused on, material building the temple. Then you have these long, discouraging halts.
The big lulls.
And then much later, you get these highly confrontational movements focused on spiritual and physical restoration. We're talking the law and then the walls.
And if you track the details, you start seeing these patterns emerge. It's a compelling look at, well, divine sovereignty, how God uses world leaders, massive empires.
But contrasted so sharply with persistent human agency and self-interest and, frankly, failure.
That's the tension. We want to understand how constant internal spiritual decay and that external political opposition, how they nearly derailed the entire identity of this returning community.
So let's jump right in. Let's set the stage. We're going to begin by examining the historical setup, the absolute necessity of the restoration, and the incredible events surrounding Cyrus's edict in 538 BC.
Before we can even celebrate the return, we have to grasp why the people were exiled in the first place. The sources are absolutely relentless on this point.
We really are.
They frame the exile not as, a simple military defeat, but as the fulfillment of ancient spiritual consequences.
This wasn't bad luck. It was covenant failure. The warnings in the law. You look at Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, they were crystal clear.
Yeah, clear.
If you reject the covenant, if you refuse to obey, the consequence is defeat and deportation. God had promised restoration, but only after the judgment of exile had been fully realized.
And that judgment came in these devastating waves. First, you have the northern kingdom, Israel, deported by the Assyrians way back in 722 BC. That effectively ended that kingdom.
Right.
But our story really focuses on the southern kingdom, Judah, which faced the rising power of Neo-Babylon.
And we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar's 3 punishing invasions of Judah. The first was in 605 BC, which took the cream of the crop, right? Daniel and his friends.
The intellectual elite, yeah.
The second in 597 BC took King Jehoiachin and a whole lot of others. And then the final catastrophic invasion in 586 BC.
That's the one.
That's the one that leveled Jerusalem and completely destroyed Solomon's magnificent temple.
And those dates, 586 BC, they're just vital. That is the destruction that marks the beginning of the clock. The 70 years of desolation starts then.
But the beauty of the source material is that it weaves in the promise of return right alongside the threat of exile.
It does. Deuteronomy 30, for instance, guarantees that if the exiled community repented, they would be gathered again and restored to the land. The hope was always there.
And the mechanism for that restoration steps onto the world stage in 539 BC with a historical earthquake, Cyrus the Great.
He conquers Babylon almost effortlessly, establishes this colossal Medo-Persian empire, and immediately institutes a policy that completely reverses decades of geopolitical strategy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? You have to remember the policy of the previous powers.
The Assyrians, the Babylonians, their whole strategy was mass deportation.
Right. They shuffled conquered people around like chess pieces.
Exactly. The whole point was to destroy national identity, to prevent rebellion. It was calculated political cruelty.
And Cyrus comes in and says, I'm doing the exact opposite. He allows, and he even encourages, conquered peoples to return to their homelands.
Which why? It's a brilliant stroke of realpolitik, really. He figured people who were loyal to their own gods, worshiping in their own lands, they'd be grateful to him.
And they would serve as stable buffer states on the borders of his empire. Smart.
Very smart. It was savvy political maneuvering, yes. But for the Jewish community and for our sources, this was nothing less than the direct fulfillment of astonishingly specific prophecy.
I mean, Jeremiah had put a time limit on the captivity. He said 70 years.
Right.
But even more dramatically, 150 years before Cyrus was even born, the prophet Isaiah had named him.
He names him as the specific king who would command the return and the rebuilding of the temple.
The idea that Isaiah 44 and 45 name a king who hasn't been born yet, predicting his actions, it's presented in the text as this undeniable proof of divine planning.
It really is. It shows the scope of what we're looking at. It's suggesting that world history isn't random, it's serving a higher purpose.
Which brings us to Cyrus's edict in 538 BC. This was a decree for the entire empire, and it did far more than just grant permission.
Oh, much more. It was like a three-part charter of restoration. First, it authorized the return to Jerusalem.
Okay.
Second, it commissioned the rebuilding of the temple.
And third, and this part is crucial, it required the surrounding populations, their immediate neighbors, to provide financial support.
Yeah, that's the kicker.
We're talking silver, gold, equipment, animals, and voluntary offerings. The king wasn't just letting them go, he was funding the operation.
And that leads to a really profound insight our sources offer, this concept of God's sovereign control over world leaders. Cyrus was likely a polytheist.
He wasn't doing this because he was a convert to Judaism.
Not at all. He was acting in his own political interest. And yet, he was simultaneously acting as an agent of Yahweh's specific will. It demonstrates that God is utterly sovereign over the plans of kings.
It's like that verse in Proverbs, right? The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord.
That's the one.
The timing is impeccable, too. The proclamation came about 67 years after the first deportation in 605, so the restoration was moving forward right on schedule.
It was, all to ensure that Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy regarding the land's desolation would be met by the time the temple was fully operational.
Okay, now let's turn to the practicalities. The first wave of return in 537 BC, because despite the massive implications of this decree, only about 50,000 Jews actually made the grueling journey.
And 50,000 sounds like a huge number for a 900-mile trek, but it's a tiny fraction of the estimated Jewish population across the empire.
The sources are careful to point that out, aren't they? That many Jews chose not to return.
They did. They were comfortable, they had built lives, businesses, they had accumulated possessions in Babylon.
That's a critical point of insight into human nature. I mean, the decree represented this incredible spiritual opportunity, a chance to return to their covenant destiny.
But so many prioritized financial security over that prophetic calling. Those who did return were mostly from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, the old southern kingdom.
And the leadership was carefully structured. You have Sheshbazzar, who was Zerubbabel's uncle. He was the official Persian-appointed governor, the political guy.
Right. But later, the popular leadership really shifted to his nephew, Zerubbabel, who carried this immense spiritual and dynastic weight.
Because he was a grandson of King Jehoiachin, right, a direct descendant of the line of David.
Exactly. His presence signaled that the royal Davidic line was being preserved and returned to the land, which was essential for the people's hope. And beside him stood Jeshua, the high priest, handling the religious authority.
But the most emotionally potent cargo they brought back, it had to be the secret vessels.
Oh, absolutely. Cyrus didn't just give them permission, he restored 5,400 gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had systematically looted from the first temple.
Think about the power of that action.
It's huge. When Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, they took those vessels as trophies. They were symbols of Yahweh's defeat, his subordination to Babylonian gods.
So the fact that Cyrus returned them was a colossal, undeniable statement. It symbolized the restoration of divine authority and legitimacy to the people's worship.
The vessels were tangible evidence that God's authority had prevailed over the greatest human empires.
But we have to note one critical absence, the Ark of the Covenant. It was not among the returned items.
No. And scholars widely speculate the Ark was either destroyed during the 586 BC siege or perhaps hidden permanently. The historian Josephus, writing much later, he confirms that the Holy of Holies in the Second Temple was empty.
And that kind of foreshadows a major theme, doesn't it? That the Second Temple, for all its importance, would never quite possess the glory or that visible divine presence that was associated with the First Temple.
It's a constant undercurrent to the whole story.
So the first wave arrives, and they immediately set to work. And what's remarkable is the sequence of priorities in 536 BC. The immediate focus wasn't, laying the stone of the temple.
No, it was about reestablishing spiritual discipline first.
Absolutely.
Within months of arriving, their first collective action was rebuilding the altar and resuming the sacrifices.
They did this on the first day of the 7th month Tishri Wanaplori, a New Year's celebration. the Feast of Trumpets.
And they did this despite being utterly exposed and, as the text says, in terror of the local peoples who surrounded them.
That's a profound act of faith, isn't it? They're prioritizing obedience and worship, offering the daily burnt sacrifices even before they had a secure physical structure around them.
It speaks to the heart of the entire restoration movement. They were demonstrating their will to act in spite of fear, adhering strictly to the law of Moses.
It's a tangible way of saying, we might not have a grand building yet, but we are back in covenant relationship. We are living sacrifices, regardless of the risk.
Well said.
So only after the worship routine was established did they move to the foundation. Later that year, the temple foundation was laid in 536 BC.
And they were meticulous. They sourced cedar from Lebanon, shipped it down to Joppa, following the exact logistics plan Solomon had used centuries earlier.
But when that foundation was laid, the sources describe one of the most psychologically complex moments of the entire deep dive. The community reaction was deeply divided.
A mix of overwhelming joy and profound grief.
Let's just linger on that moment. It's in Ezra 3. The younger generation, they shouted with joy. They had something tangible, a foundation.
But the older priests and elders, those who had actually seen Solomon's temple, they wept loudly.
So why such sorrow amid success?
Because the comparison was just devastating for them. They remembered the splendor, the immense gold plating, the towering size of Solomon's temple. What they were laying now, while necessary, must have looked so humble, small, insufficient by comparison.
It's the burden of memory, isn't it? The memory of past glory can often paralyze or undermine present effort.
That's a powerful insight. They couldn't simply celebrate the accomplishment because the ghost of what was magnificent overshadowed the reality of what is achievable.
The text says the mixed noise of joyous shouts and bitter weeping was indistinguishable. That perfectly symbolizes the internal conflict of the whole project living between a glorious past and a challenging, modest present.
And that moment of mixed emotion gave way almost immediately to the problem of external opposition. This is where the locals stepped in.
These were the people living in the area, the ones we later call Samaritans. They were descendants of various foreign nations that Assyrian kings had settled there after deporting the northern kingdom.
Right, and they had a mixed religion. They worshiped their own pagan idols, but they also acknowledged Yahweh as the local god of the land, a syncretistic mess.
So they approached Zerubbabel and Jeshua with an offer to help rebuild. They say, we seek your God as you do.
But the Jewish leadership refused, flat out.
That refusal seems politically unwise, doesn't it? They needed labor, they needed resources. Why risk immediate conflict by rejecting this offer of aid?
Because for Zerubbabel and Jeshua, this was a moment of uncompromising spiritual integrity. The law, the very reason they had been exiled and were now restored, required exclusive worship of Yahweh.
So accepting help from those who didn't worship Yahweh exclusively would be an immediate compromise.
An immediate compromise of their covenant identity, and historically the very thing that led to idolatry in the first place. They knew that if they compromised on obedience to gain quick success, they would just be repeating the failures of the past.
And the rejection was immediately weaponized. The locals didn't just go away.
No, they embarked on a sustained campaign of subversion. The sources tell us they discouraged, they disheartened the Jews, and they even hired advisors and lobbyists to frustrate their plans.
They were masters of bureaucracy and slander.
They were. And this opposition, combined with the returnees' own declining zeal, they started getting busy building their own comfortable paneled houses, as Haggai would later accuse them.
That led to the infamous 16-year stoppage.
Yes. From 536 BC to 520 BC, the temple work just ceased. The only thing standing was the foundation and the altar. This long halt is explicitly pointed out in Ezra 4.24. It's a study in how easily the highest spiritual aspirations can be derailed.
Derailed by outside pressure and, personal comfort.
Exactly.
Now, we absolutely have to address the chronological complexities here, because this is where a lot of readers get lost. The writer of Ezra interrupts the story of the temple halt.
Yes.
By inserting descriptions of opposition that happened much, much later, sometimes a century later.
This is a critical point that needs signposting. The writer wasn't concerned with strictly linear time. They were concerned with showing the spirit of antagonism that was constant throughout the whole restoration period.
So he's grouping all the opposition together thematically.
Precisely. He inserts these later examples to demonstrate that Israel's enemies never stopped trying to stop the rebuilding efforts, whether it was the temple or the law or later the walls.
So immediately after describing the 16-year halt on the temple, the text jumps ahead decades. It mentions an accusation filed during the reign of Ahasuerus, who is Xerxes I. That's nearly 50 years after the temple stalled.
And then the text jumps even further forward to the reign of Artaxerxes I, around 446 BC. And this is where we learn about enemies like Rehum and Shimshai successfully petitioning the king to halt the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem.
This is the critical distinction for you, the listener. The opposition in the beginning of Ezra 4 stopped the temple foundation under Cyrus and Darius.
Right.
The opposition later in Ezra 4 stopped the wall rebuilding under Artaxerxes, a king who reigned almost a century later. Two different projects, two different kings, same goal. Stop the Jews from reestablishing a strong center.
And Rehum and Shimshai were incredibly effective lobbyists. They framed Jerusalem not just as a city being rebuilt, but as a rebellious and odious city.
And they cited historical fact, right? Jerusalem had a long proven history of rebellion against its overlords.
They did. They pointed back to Hezekiah and Zedekiah. They argued that if the walls were completed, the city would inevitably stop paying taxes and revolt.
And Artaxerxes bought the argument. After checking the royal archives, which confirmed Jerusalem's troublesome history, he issued a temporary order to halt the work on the walls.
Just until he could figure out a permanent policy solution. And the enemies acted quickly. The text notes they went up to Jerusalem and made them cease by force of arms. A day of humiliation and shame.
All of which illustrates that securing political legitimacy from the empire was just as difficult as acquiring building materials.
It was. But remember, all this is a flash forward. Back in our main timeline, the temple itself remained stalled until 520 BC, when the true engine of the work returned.
Prophecy. 16 years of silence. The foundation is laid, the people are comfortable in their own homes, and the enthusiasm is just gone. The sources make it so clear that the project would have failed entirely had God not intervened dramatically in 520 BC by sending two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah.
This is a massive turning point. Haggai was the more direct, sort of fire and brimstone prophet. His message centered on the people's misplaced priorities.
He basically asked, is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses while this house, the temple, lies desolate?
That little detail, the panel houses, it just brings the historical context alive. They were prioritizing luxury over their sacred responsibility.
And Haggai directly connected their current economic struggles, drought, poor harvests, lack of prosperity, to their spiritual negligence.
He did. The message was, you scatter much seed, but bring in little harvest because you put your own comfort ahead of God's command.
And it worked. The motivation worked. Zerubbabel, the governor, and Jeshua, the high priest, were moved by the prophetic word and immediately resumed construction.
And just as quickly as they resumed the work, the political challenge returned.
Tatnai, the Persian governor of Trans-Euphrates, shows up. With the reign having changed since Cyrus's death, Tatnai needed to verify the authority of this massive, unauthorized construction project.
What's fascinating is the shift in tone from the earlier enemies. Tatnai's letter to the new king, Darius I the Great, it was purely bureaucratic. It was objective and fair.
He wasn't malicious like Rehum and Shimshai. He just wanted to see the official documentation.
And the Jewish elders demonstrated incredible courage here. They didn't wait for Darius's reply. While Tatnai was writing his objective inquiry, the elders kept the construction going.
They maintained their perseverance despite the immediate challenge to their political legitimacy.
Tatnai's letter actually described the work ethic of the Jews, and he reported their elders' explanation, that they were servants of the God of heaven and earth, rebuilding a temple authorized by Cyrus the Great.
So Darius I, who ruled from 521 to 486 BC, he orders an imperial search. He didn't find the original decree in Babylon, though.
No, but they found a memorandum in Ecbatana, which was Cyrus's summer capital, that confirmed the edict and provided some astonishing details.
And these details are stunning because they reveal the scale of Cyrus's original ambition. The memorandum specified that the temple was to be built to massive dimensions, 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide.
That's roughly 90 feet by 90 feet. This was a command to build a structure that was actually larger than Solomon's had been.
Wait, 90 feet high and 90 feet wide? That would have dwarfed the previous structure. It would have been a genuine monument to the Persian Empire's tolerance.
It would have.
But our sources suggest the final temple didn't reach this size, which just highlights that point of human failure again, doesn't it?
It does. Here was the Persian government offering unlimited political and financial will. The budget was committed to building a world-class monument. And yet, because of that 16-year halt and maybe a pervasive lack of faith and vision among the people, They settled for a smaller, less grand structure that the old people wept over.
The resources were there, but the sustained commitment wasn't.
Exactly.
So Darius was thorough. He not only confirmed Cyrus's decree, but he issued an incredibly fierce new decree himself, cementing the project's protection.
He instructed Tatnai to immediately stop harassing them and confirmed royal funding for the project and for the daily sacrifices. He specifically mandated that Tatnai use the provincial taxes to provide everything they needed.
Oxen, rams, lambs, wheat, salt, wine, oil, everything.
Right. And why provide the sacrifices?
So that the Jews could pray for the life of the king and his sons.
Exactly. Darius recognized the power of the Jews' God, and he wanted to buy divine favor. He wasn't necessarily a convert, but he certainly recognized political expediency and the benefit of having a powerful deity on his side.
And the enforcement clause was absolutely terrifying. Darius enforced the decree with a threat of impalement.
Yeah, that's a serious threat. He warned that if anyone changed his directive, a beam would be pulled from their own house, they would be raised up and impaled upon it, and their house would be reduced to a pile of rubble.
This vivid, severe threat just underscores the absolute nature of Persian law.
It does, and it shows the depth of royal commitment to this project. And Tatnai complied precisely and quickly.
So with the political opposition neutralized and the royal treasury paying the bills, the temple was finally completed on Adar III in late February 515 BC.
And the historical and prophetic timing is perfect. This date is 70 years after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC. Jeremiah's prediction of the land's desolation was fulfilled to the letter.
And this second temple would stand for 585 years until the Romans destroyed it in AD 70.
A very long time.
The dedication ceremony was massive and joyful.
It was a collective sigh of relief and celebration. The offerings included 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and 12 male goats, one sin offering for each of the 12 tribes of Israel.
So they were proclaiming the reunification of the Jewish people, even if only a remnant had returned.
That was the message. And they reestablished the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They celebrated because God had changed the opinion of the king of Assyria.
That phrase is interesting. Why would they call Darius of Persia the king of Assyria?
It's a great piece of historical language. In the ancient Near East, the phrase king of Assyria just became a broad historical term used in a generic sense to refer to the dominant world power.
So it means the current ruler who occupied the ancient Assyrian territory, in this case, the Persian emperor.
Exactly. It's a linguistic shortcut demonstrating that God turned the heart of the mighty overlord to assist them rather than crush them.
Okay, so the temple is finished in 515 BC. The future looks bright. But our sources immediately highlight a massive 58-year gap before the story resumes with Ezra.
Yeah, it's long silence. This gap from 515 BC to 458 BC is defined by spiritual stagnation.
The period saw 3 kings on the Persian throne. After Darius I came Xerxes I.
Who was famously known as Ahasuerus, the husband of Esther.
Right. Then came Artaxerxes I. During this time, the entire drama of the Book of Esther took place in the capital of Susa.
Which illustrates how large and politically connected the Jewish diaspora remained across the empire.
That's fascinating context. While this small remnant in Jerusalem was struggling, the Jewish community in the diaspora had enough clout to produce a Queen Esther who could save her entire people from a genocide.
It does. It shows the sheer political breadth of the Jewish population outside the Promised Land. But back in Judah, the zeal just waned dramatically after the temple was finished.
People became complacent.
Utterly. They were content with the form of worship, just having a temple. They didn't fortify the city, and worse, they started compromising the religious distinctives.
The decline was multifaceted. Intermarriage with non-Jewish neighbors occurred frequently. The Levites, who were supposed to be the teachers and custodians of the law, neglected their duties.
And the focus shifted from living according to the covenant to merely observing rituals.
This systemic moral decay set the stage for the next major intervention. We jump to 458 BC and the arrival of Ezra, a figure often considered a second Moses.
The second Moses for his dedication to law and reform. He was a descendant of Aaron, which gave him authority as a priest, but he was most renowned as a skilled scribe.
And scribe in this context meant far more than a secretary, right?
Oh, much more. It meant an expert in the Mosaic law, holding a position of high respect within the Babylonian Jewish community. His name, Ezra, even means Yahweh has helped.
And the core of Ezra's power wasn't just his position, it was his personal commitment, which is beautifully captured in Ezra 7.9.
It is. The sources emphasize his 3-part resolution, and the order is just critical.
Yes, Ezra dedicated himself to 1, studying the law of the Lord, 2, observing or practicing the law, and 3, teaching its statutes and judgments in Israel.
And that sequence is a masterclass in leadership and reform. You have to master the content before you can live it, and you have to live it convincingly before you can teach it to others. Integrity precedes instruction.
So Artaxerxes I commissions Ezra in 458 BC, giving him incredible power, effectively making him the royal representative for all Jewish affairs across the region west of the Euphrates.
The decree from Artaxerxes was sweeping. It encouraged more exiles to return. It authorized Ezra to use unlimited funds from the provincial treasury for temple support.
And most critically, it authorized Ezra to establish judicial and educational systems based on God's law throughout the province.
And that's the key distinction, isn't it? Zerubbabel's mission was material, the temple. Ezra's mission was purely social and spiritual, building, installing the law, justice, and education.
That's a whole new phase of restoration.
A whole new phase. And Artaxerxes' motivation, much like Darius's, was rooted in fear and self-interest. The decree explicitly asks why they should risk the wrath of the God of heaven against the king and his family.
So he wanted to appease this God by making sure his rules were followed.
Which demonstrates once again that God sovereignly uses the self-serving interests of world leaders to achieve his spiritual goals.
So, with the decree in hand, Ezra begins his journey of faith in 458 BC. He leads a smaller group than the first return, about 5,000 people total.
And the sources detail his meticulous preparations. They camped by the Ahava Canal for 3 days, and Ezra noticed a major problem, a severe shortage of Levites.
The very people who were indispensable for teaching the law and serving the temple.
Right. This forced him to halt the journey and actively recruit 38 Levites and 220 temple servants from Casiphia before they could proceed. It shows his prioritization of spiritual function over sheer speed.
But the most dramatic moment of that journey involved the treasure. Ezra was transporting a colossal amount of wealth, 650 talents of silver, 100 talents of gold.
Plus thousands of precious vessels. And he refused to ask Artaxerxes for an armed escort of soldiers and horsemen to protect this treasure.
Why refuse? I mean, it seems pragmatically foolish to move a massive amount of gold and silver across 900 miles of bandit territory without protection.
Because Ezra had already boasted to the king about God's powerful protection over those who seek him. To then ask for a physical, human escort would have publicly undermined his entire testimony and God's reputation.
It was a leadership moment where integrity and public commitment took precedence over safety. He considered it a matter of God's honor.
Exactly.
So instead of a guard, what did he do?
He called a public fast by the Ahava Canal, humbling themselves and seeking safe passage from God. This focused the community on dependence on the divine, rather than on political or military strength.
And the sources are careful to note that the 4-month journey was completed safely.
Delivered from enemies and bandits, confirming Ezra's faith. And yet, even with that great act of faith, Ezra still demonstrated incredible worldly wisdom and accountability regarding the money.
Right. Faith doesn't mean recklessness.
Not at all. Ezra meticulously weighed and documented every piece of silver and gold and delegated specific responsibility to 12 leading priests and Levites. This rigorous accountability was a sign of wisdom, protecting against any potential accusations of fraud or scandal.
So Ezra arrives in Jerusalem 4 months later, ready to implement his reforms, but he is met almost immediately with a devastating spiritual and social crisis.
The community leaders informed Ezra that many Jews, including priests and Levites, the very people who should have known better, had intermarried with the surrounding detestable peoples.
Canaanites, Hittites, Moabites, Egyptians, and others. And the core issue, which must be carefully understood from the source material, was not racial, but covenantal and religious.
Absolutely. The surrounding populations were polytheists. Intermarriage was forbidden because it historically and inevitably led the people of Israel into idolatry and covenant breaking.
Which was the very sin that caused the exile in the first place.
It was. The law explicitly forbade this. And the source material adds a painful detail. The leaders and the officials have been at the forefront of all this unfaithfulness.
So when the people who are supposed to enforce the boundaries are the ones breaking them, the system has completely collapsed.
Completely.
And Ezra's response to this news is one of the most physically and emotionally expressive reactions in the sources.
It was extreme devastation. He tore his tunic and robe, he ripped hair from his head and beard, and he sat utterly devastated until the time of the evening offering.
This wasn't theatrical despair, it was a profound act of spiritual solidarity.
Right. Even though he had been separate from the sin, He fully identified with the guilt of the community, recognizing the gravity of repeating the failures of the past.
His subsequent prayer, recorded in Ezra 9, is just heartbreaking. It is a massive act of public confession.
It's defined by deep humility. Ezra didn't just confess their general guilt. He specifically acknowledged that their current sin was worse than the past because they had just been shown such extraordinary mercy.
Restored to the land, funded by Persian kings.
And yet they immediately reverted to the old destructive patterns. He essentially asked God how they could possibly expect any further mercy after such a swift betrayal of their covenant identity.
And the result of Ezra's public grief was contagious. A very large crowd gathered around him, weeping loudly and trembling because they recognized the severity of their error.
And out of that collective despair came a radical proposal from a man named Shechaniah. He proposed enacting a covenant with God to send away to divorce all foreign wives and their children.
He argued this was the only way to guard the purity and distinctiveness of the community to fulfill its covenant purpose.
A radical solution.
It is, and this is a crucial point that requires careful unpacking. If the sources recognize that God hates divorce, as we see later confirmed in Malachi, how do the sources justify this systematic, mandatory divorce?
It's a complex ethical and theological dilemma, viewed through the lens of covenant preservation. The sources provide a vital contextual point. These marriages were considered null and void from the outset.
Because they were illegal.
They were illegal, unlawful unions performed contrary to the foundational law of Moses. Therefore, the drastic action was seen not as breaking a valid marriage, but as correcting an ongoing, illegal, covenant-destroying violation.
So the argument is that the larger goal was the preservation of Israel as a distinct holy people.
Exactly. If they assimilated and adopted the idolatry of the surrounding nations, the covenant line and the future hope of redemption would be extinguished. The fate of the many depended on the purity of the few.
The sources are clear that this was necessary to protect their unique identity as a holy race, a phrase explicitly used in the text.
It was about separating Israel from the pagan practices of the surrounding peoples, ensuring the continuity of monotheism in a polytheistic world.
So Ezra acts swiftly. He secures an oath from the leaders and issues a dramatic summons, requiring all men of Judah and Benjamin to assemble in Jerusalem within 3 days.
And failure to attend meant absolute social and economic ruin, forfeiture of all property, and exclusion from the assembly. The call was non-negotiable.
And this was during the 9th month, the rainy season.
The rainy season. The people assembled in the open square, trembling from the gravity of the matter and from the downpour.
The people accepted the plan, but recognizing the complexity of the matter, they requested a systematic, formalized process.
Which was wise. This wasn't a quick emotional decision. It required immense administrative effort. Leaders were appointed to investigate each case.
And the proceedings began on the first day of the 10th month and were systematically completed on the first day of the first month of the following year. A dedicated process taking 3 months to finalize.
Yes. And the final documented list showed 113 Israelites who had married and divorced foreign wives.
That number seems small relative to the total population of 50,000.
It does, but the influence was magnified by who was involved. It included 16 priests and 10 Levites.
A leadership.
It shows that the failure was deeply embedded within the religious and civil leadership, who were supposed to be the guardians of the law. Ezra's radical work successfully reset the moral compass of the community, allowing them to finally establish their spiritual identity securely. And this set the foundation for the later physical rebuilding of the walls under Nehemiah.
So when we look back at this 100-year chronicle of restoration, what's the ultimate synthesized takeaway for you, the listener? We see this incredible sequence, massive divine intervention, incredible human effort, and then immediate profound human failure.
It is a stunning display of persistent grace meeting persistent complacency. God uses world-dominating kings like Cyrus and Artaxerxes to decree restoration, sends powerful prophets like Haggai and Zechariah to redirect priorities, and yet
we see the returnees stall for 16 years and rapidly fall into spiritual decline, requiring Ezra's radical intervention.
it's just a constant cycle.
If we synthesize the 3 major phases of the restoration, we get a really clear picture of what was accomplished over this century.
We do. The first return, back in 538 BC with Zerubbabel, that was the material restoration. It was focused on rebuilding the central place of worship, the temple.
Then the second return, 458 BC with Ezra, that was the spiritual restoration, focused on rebuilding the identity, justice, and adherence to the law.
And the third return, just 13 years later in 445 BC with Nehemiah, that would focus on the physical restoration, the rebuilding of the defensive walls.
The order really matters, doesn't it? You build the temple, then you build the character, and only then can you effectively build the defense.
Precisely. And this leads us back to that powerful recurring pattern the sources highlight, the struggle between opportunity and execution. Think again about Cyrus's decree for a magnificent temple.
90 feet by 90 feet, fully funded by the royal treasury.
They had the political mandate, they had the funding, they had the initial enthusiasm, and yet they ended up settling for something far less grand. A structure that made the older generation weep for its modesty.
They consistently failed to take full advantage of the resources God sovereignly provided.
And this raises a powerful, final, provocative thought for you to consider. This restoration period is a chronic reminder that resources, opportunity, and even clear divine direction are not enough to guarantee success. How often in our own lives, our organizations, or our communities do we start with immense enthusiasm and massive resources, whether they are financial, intellectual, or spiritual, only to allow the glory of the project to be diminished, slowed, or outright halted by external discouragement and internal apathy?
That's a challenging question. How often does a glorious foundation fail to translate into sustained, full-scale success?
That gap between the potential and the reality is what defines the human element in this incredible story.